Today, we're here to celebrate the publication of Beyond Borders, Exploring the History of Cornell's Global Dimensions. It is my pleasure to introduce you to my colleagues, the best team of editors I've ever known. In the summer of 2021, I was invited to join Professor Emeritus Roy Coley, Heike Michelson, and Corey Earle to jumpstart the project that Roy had been working on intermittently since 2003. We met regularly in person and emailed frequently, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times in a day, as we re-envisioned the project from a straight history to a lively anthology of brief, evocative accounts that we called vignettes. The book would not be comprehensive, that was impossible, but it would concentrate on selected highlights from each of the colleges and across the globe. It would be directed toward a general audience, readable and not academic. We came up with ideas and we solicited suggestions and authors from CAPE members and others. Retired and active Cornell faculty and staff responded enthusiastically, offering to write about the history or their personal experiences. And Wendy Walford, Cornell's Vice Provost for International Affairs, agreed to contribute an afterword. We worked closely with those authors in the editorial process. We requested photographs from the authors and searched for additional ones ourselves, online through University Photography, thank you, and originals in the Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections, thank you. We convinced the Cornell University Press that our book was worthy of their interest, and we had fun. It was a perfect team. All of us had extensive experience at Cornell. 3 of us are alumni. 2 of us had extensive international experience. 2 of us were experts in Cornell history. I'll introduce each of the speakers here in the order in which they'll be speaking. Each of us will tell you something about the process, and then we'll describe some of our favorite vignettes. We should have plenty of time for questions, so please hold them until everyone is finished. At the end of the program, copies of Beyond Border are available for sale for $25, cash or check only. So, Roy Coley, Professor Emeritus of Communication at Cornell. He received a PhD from Cornell in 1967 and taught development communication for 40 years, serving as chair of the Department of Communication from 1986 to 1995. Roy worked on Cornell projects in India, Samoa, Guatemala, and Vietnam, and served as a consultant on development communication projects in Africa, Asia, and Latin America for many international organizations. He received the International Communication Association Lifetime Achievement Award and is recognized on the Wall of Honor at the East-West Center in Honolulu for his development work in Asia. Among the vignettes that Roy wrote for Beyond Borders, Cornell Expands the Digital World details his work in expanding communications technology internationally. Notably, in the 1990s, his work in Singapore, where he was largely responsible for the development of the School of Communication and Information at the Nanyang Technological University. In 1995, he was honored as the first person to be named to an endowed professorship at this new school. Heike Michelson was Director of Programming for Cornell's Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies for 16 years until her retirement in 2019. Before that, she was a Senior Research Officer at the International Service for Agricultural Research based in the Netherlands, working in sub-Saharan Africa. She also served as a consultant to the Social Science Research Council, the American Council on Education, and the Network for Agricultural Research for Development. Heike holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Hohenheim. Among the vignettes that Heike wrote, the Bartels World Fellows highlights some of her experiences with distinguished international speakers who came to Cornell as part of the Einaudi Center's Bartels program. I'm, of course, Elaine Engst, and I'm currently Cornell University Archivist Emerita. I received an MA in history from Cornell in 1972, and I began work in the Cornell University Library in 1979, serving many roles until my retirement in 2015. Notably as director of the Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections and Cornell University Archivist, the best job in the university. I've given numerous presentations, curated exhibitions and websites, and written articles, reviews, exhibitions, catalogs, and books. Since I was deeply involved with the library's Asia collections during my career, it was a real pleasure to write the vignette Asia Collections in the Cornell University Library, which gave me the opportunity to revisit some of those collections, to learn about new collections that came after I retired, and to work again with old friends. Corey Earle is a visiting lecturer in the American Studies program, where he has been teaching an extremely popular course on the history of Cornell since 2011. I would say 1911. He's a frequent speaker and author on topics related to Cornell history and serves as a resource for departments and organizations across campus, while also working in the Alumni Affairs and Development since 2008. He serves on the alumni boards for the Glee Club and the Cornell Media Guild WBBR-FM. Corey received a BS from Cornell in 2007 and an MA from Teachers College, Columbia. With his interest in the Glee Club as a student and alumnus, Corey contributed the vignette Performing Around the World on the history of the Glee Club as global ambassadors for the university and the nation through their international concerts and tours. So without further ado, I'll give it to Roy.
Yeah. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We'd like to start by thanking Jane Bunker, director of the Cornell University Press, and to all those people at the press for their great support in making this book possible. You know, there have been many good books about Cornell University and its history. And someone asked us recently, what's different about Beyond Borders? Well, my answer is that the subtitle, Exploring the History of Cornell's Global Dimensions, is the answer to that question. Beyond Borders highlights and celebrates Cornell's many global dimensions, going right back to its founding. More than 50 authors contributed to the book, many who themselves played pivotal roles in Cornell's global history. In the book, they take readers to China and the Philippines, to Peru, to Qatar and India, to Eastern Europe, to Zambia and Sierra Leone, and to many more places. The book includes 58 pieces that we call vignettes, each one 3 to 5 pages long. Now, can you imagine asking a Cornell faculty member or staff to write something 3 to 5 pages long? It's hard to believe, but they did it, and they did a wonderful job. One of our vignettes actually reaches back to 1868. That's when Andrew Dixon White traveled to Europe to get various resources, including faculty, for the new Cornell University. The vignette is titled, "Don't Forget the Horses." Don't forget the horse doctor. That was what Cornell's president, Ezra Cornell, was supposed to have said to Andrew Dixon White when he was going off to Europe to get those resources. That horse doctor was whom? That horse doctor was James Law in Scotland, and he was Cornell's first veterinary professor. So don't forget the horse doctor. The book had its start about 20 years ago. I was on the board of CAPE at that time, along with Bill Ward. And some of you may remember Bill Ward. Bill Ward was head of the communication department for many years. He was a member of the CAPE organization. And he was also a resident here at Kendall. As we reflected at one meeting on our experiences overseas, I guess it was I who raised the question, how about another book? There needs to be a book about what all these people have done around the world. At that point, CAPE accepted that challenge, and with financial support from international programs in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and from Cornell's International Programs Office, we were off and on track. Well, I don't know whether we were on track or not. That was in the year 2003. I got somewhat sidetracked by some voluntary work abroad in South Korea. I did a lot of interviewing of people, and you can see those interviews and hear those interviews on eCommons. There's probably 5 or 6 or 7, and some of them took place in far off places like the Philippines, and some right there in New York City. But there was no book. But in 2021, CAPE said, get on track. And so, yes, we had to get on track. At that time, there was no advisory group for the book, but there was a advisory group formed by CAPE, and that advisory group turned into a working group, and that working group turned into the editors of this book. Let's visit one of the vignettes. I'll read some of this. You can read the whole thing if you get the book. This particular vignette is about Ida Scudder, class of 1899. Ida was an American girl who lived in India with her missionary family. Her father was a medical missionary in India, and her father had 7 brothers. All 7 were missionaries. And Ida one time said, missionaries, that's enough missionaries. She said she was never going to be a missionary. But her life took a dramatic change one night in India when she heard 3 knocks. And this is what happened. While Ida sat writing letters, 3 men came to her door, each one, strangely enough, with the same request, that she come to his house and try to save the life of his very young wife, who was dying in childbirth. But I know nothing about doctoring, she told each one. It's my father who is the doctor. I'll be glad to go with him. Oh, no, each one replied. The Brahmin, the Muslim, and another high caste Hindu. It was not in accordance with his religion to allow any man outside the family to enter the women's quarters of his home. Better that his wife should die than the laws governing her soul's salvation should be broken. 3 times this happened, and Ida was much troubled. She spent a sleepless night, and in the morning, she sent a servant to find out what had happened to those 3 young women. Even before he returned, she heard the sound of funeral tom-toms as processions made their way to the riverbank. Each one of the wives had died because there was no woman doctor to go to them. That was her calling. All other ambitions were swept aside. Ida returned to the US and eventually to medical school. And that medical school was Cornell's new medical school. She was one of 12 women in the first graduating class in the newly established Cornell Medical College in New York City. Immediately after graduation in 1900, the new Dr. Ida Scudder returned to India to start a 1-room dispensary clinic in her father's bungalow in Vellore. There she handed out medicines from a window to a long line of female patients. But now let's look at other things that she accomplished. 1902, after small expansions of her bungalow dispensary, Ida opened a 40-bed hospital for women and children. Later, this became the Christian Medical College in Vellore, India. 1909, traveling by train, by carriage, or by pony cart. She also established a roadside dispensary service to treat patients who couldn't make the trip to Vellore. 1918, with the help of many Christian denominations, she also founded a college to train women doctors. Beginning with 17 girls, all taught by herself, it grew into a great complex of buildings in a beautiful valley, graduating over the years thousands of skilled, dedicated women doctors. And in 1924, Ida's original hospital became the Christian Medical College and Hospital, a new 267-bedded hospital in Vellore, India. In the 100 years plus since Ida Scudder opened this first small clinic in the Vellore area, there has been significant growth in healthcare services in the institutions that she started. The typical daily activities that go on there today involve more than 2,000 inpatients and 8,000 outpatients. Dr. Ida Scudder died in her bungalow in India in 1960, age 89. The Ida Scudder School in Vellore is named in her honor, and guess what? There's a road there in Vellore named after her. Biographer Dorothy Clark Wilson writes, Dr. Ida lighted a small candle. In her hands, it became a blazing torch. Her successors have taken up forth the torch of life, passed it from hand to hand, multiplied it by thousands until its light illuminates not only in the land of India, but in many other countries of the world. Well, Ida died, but Ida Scudder carries on. Dr. Madeline Finkel, a professor at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City, has continued the Cornell connection with the Scudder family's India. Under her direction, second-year medical Cornell students spend summers in Vellore doing public health research. Fourth-year students go on 4 to 6 week clinical rotations in India. The Scudder family has funded the Ida Scudder 1899 Fellowship annually, allowing a Cornell medical student to spend 4 years in Vellore. And that was Cornell's Dr. Ida Scudder. Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Roy. A little bit of history here. I met Roy actually the first time in 2005. And I know it precisely because I have a write-up of the meeting. It was on February 11th. And it was a month after I started working for the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies. And we discussed, of course, his project on the history of Cornell's international dimension. So 16 years later, shortly before I retired from Cornell in 21, I was appointed to this advisory group that was already mentioned, and then Roy asked me to become part of the editorial team, a real pleasure. And for me, it was a kind of perfect opportunity to reflect on the work that I had done in international studies at Cornell, but also it was a very meaningful transition into my retirement. But I had one condition to this, and that was that we get this project done within a couple of years. And we did it. So I'm very proud of that. So time and the right timing was definitely key factors during the whole process of the production of the book. As already pointed out, we solicited and received very valuable input from across key units and faculty. Skipped one here. I just list a few of the colleges over there and some of the key units. And then in spring 22, so relatively soon, we had, our team had conceptualized the book. We had drafted a few example vignettes, identified potential topics from each of the colleges and these cross-campus endeavors, and contacted potential authors. It was not always easy to identify and commit authors for some topics that we felt were essential to be included in the book. It required many rounds of solicitations, and some chapters actually needed to be drafted by members of the editorial team. And for some topics, unfortunately, we didn't find enough information to do so. But it was a real pleasure to work with so many extraordinary authors on the book. Sometimes a challenge too. So many of them played really a key role in the history himself of International Cornell. We had given very specific guidelines to the authors. They got very tight deadlines to produce these relatively small vignettes. And for many, it was just one of these extra tasks to an already very, very heavy schedule. And some needed some extra reminders. But each of the 54 authors communicated with one member of the team, but all the 4 of us were reviewing all the different contributions. And many drafts were really, they were excellent, but also, as Roy already pointed out, too long or needed to be a little bit, needed some extra references or extra information. Others needed to be rewritten in a language that was more suitable for a very broad audience that we would try to address with the book. But then, by the end of 2022, we had already all the drafts completed. And I'm very, very pleased that we have here today, here we see the list of, oops, this goes too fast, the list of all the 54 authors. And I'm very pleased that some of them are here in the audience. But I'm also very sorry to say that 2 of the authors passed away last year, which was Jean German and Su-Lin May. And we are very honored that Theresa May and Jean German is here with us today to celebrate the book on behalf of their late husbands. And maybe it would be nice if the 2 and also the authors could briefly stand up and we could just see who is in the audience as an author of the book. Thank you. Thank you. So the chapters, let's see, going a little further here. The chapters take us around the world, but also highlight the many global activities on the Ithaca campus. There are chapters from each college, and as well as many of the university-wide units since the founding of the university, and no decade is actually untouched. The scope of the chapters is worldwide, others are regional, some are focusing on a specific country. And the activities described, there is a focus for some on research, teaching, or services, and some address all of these or some of these together. As you can imagine, we had a long discussion about how to outline the book. And in the end, it is a mix of all these different characteristics of the chapters. So we just decided to have basically a part 1 that focuses on research, teaching, and services for those activities that were fostered by the university and its colleges. And in the part 2, we highlight those experiences from alumni and students. So very early in 2023, we signed the contract with CU Press, and we discussed with them the overall design of the book and how we envision it. And we basically wanted to include a few photos, 1 or 2 photos in each of the vignettes. And you might imagine we received for some of the vignettes lots of photos, and for others we didn't receive any. And we had to really address this need and come up with some photos and images from the archives and from Cornell photography. So the photos had to have certain characteristics. Of course, they had to complement the text. They had to be looking good in black and white. We received many photos since the 1970s, I think at least they were all in color. They had to be very good quality and of high resolution so that they could look good in the print. But then we also, in addition to all of that, we had to identify who is actually the owner of the photo, which is not always easy, clarify the copyrights, and obtain a written agreement for the right to use the book, not only in print, but also online. This was a real challenge. And it took us until August 23 that we submitted all the 110 photo files, plus the 101 files with permissions, written permissions to CU Press. So lastly, I just wanted to give you a little summary of one of the vignettes, which is representing one of the many international programs that are actually featured in the book. And this one is titled The Southeast Asia Program, Global Cornell from the Beginning. And it was written by Professor Thomas Pipinski, who is the director of the Southeast Asia Program. So the Southeast Asia Program at Cornell is one of the world's most preeminent centers for the study of Southeast Asia, a region of nearly 700 million people living in 11 independent states that lie between China, India, and Australia. CEIP faculty members, past and present, include some of the most prominent scholars of the region and its people, and its alumni can be found in teaching and research positions around the world. CEIP was officially established in 1950s after the university secured a major grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to support Southeast Asian studies, and Cornell was the second major Southeast Asia program after Yale. Tom Pipinski highlights 3 features that make the program particular. So the first one is the political engagement. Many of the program's most prominent founding faculty were committed to ensuring that the United States foreign policy community had a more sophisticated understanding of the region and its people than they had earlier. Scholars also contribute to the public debates and the policy discourse about the region more generally. The second point he is making is that CEIP faculty institutionalized a model for Southeast Asian studies, which is linking the specific disciplines, but not only the humanities and the social sciences, but also the applied sciences. And yet, nevertheless, is interdisciplinary in essence. So the role of the program, of the Southeast Asia program, was to build an interdisciplinary space in which students and faculty can learn from each other. And the last point he makes, and perhaps most importantly, is that CEIP relied heavily on visiting faculty and scholars in its early years due to the shortage of knowledgeable US-based experts on the region. This outward orientation also meant that the program welcomed students from around the world, and many returned to their home countries after graduation to found and or lead their own academic communities. So now, 75 years later, CEIP remains one of the most prominent, dynamic, and interesting area study centers in the world. The faculty continues to produce important scholarship on Southeast Asia, both studies that are very particular on a certain event, places, or issue, but also broad comparative work that looked beyond the region itself to see its connection with the changing global environment. And lastly, and I think very important too, is that the Southeast Asia program also enjoys the fortune of being the only continuously funded center for National Resource Center on campus. This is a grant from the Department of Education within Title VI. And this programming that this supports helps to train the next generation of globally engaged experts on Southeast Asia and its wide connections. So I stop here and hand it over to Elaine to talk a little bit more about her favorite vignettes. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see if I can get the microphone right this time. That's okay? Okay. Okay, I began this project thinking that I knew a lot about Cornell history, but I was intrigued and surprised by many of the stories I read as part of the editing process. For example, I knew that Cornell's first major international effort took place at the University of Nanjing now, as a crop improvement project, but I did not know that a variety of barley from China contributed to improved winter barley in New York State. I also had read a lot about Hu Xie, probably Cornell's most famous alumnus, but I hadn't known that he was the last foreign diplomat to meet with President Franklin Roosevelt on the morning of December 7th, 1942, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I knew that Myron Taylor had been a personal envoy to the Vatican under President Franklin Roosevelt, and I'd worked with law professor Herbert Briggs on his papers, but I didn't know that Professor Rudy Schlesinger, a German emigre who came to Cornell in 1948, is seen as the dean of the discipline of comparative law in the US, with a textbook now in its 7th edition. Many of the other vignettes also fascinated me and added more dimensions to the picture that is Cornell. But I was particularly intrigued by entomology professor Anthony Shelton's chapter on BT eggplant, improving lives with biotechnology. I knew that Cal's faculty had many projects in Asia, but I had no idea that they were developing a genetically engineered eggplant. Eggplant is called brinjal in Bengali, named BT brinjal for the bacillus that would confer resistance to the eggplant fruit and shoot borer, EFSB. There is a nasty looking bug. I really like eggplant, and we grow eggplant in our garden, but I didn't know that it was an important food crop in Bangladesh, India, and the Philippines. I learned that the project began in 2005 as part of a program, quote, to use bioengineered crops to help boost food security, economic growth, nutrition, and environmental quality in selected countries, unquote. Eggplant seemed to be an obvious choice. It was a major crop, and the borer was its main enemy. I was horrified by Professor Shelton's description, and I quote him. I visited brinjal fields in India and heard how farmers tried to control EFSB using frequent, sometimes twice a day, insecticide spraying. Thinking I had misunderstood the frequency, I asked the farmer again and again in different ways, but each time the answer was the same. The farmer further explained that he often sprayed on the day of harvest. When asked what insecticides he used, he replied it was usually a cocktail of insecticides. During my visit, again Anthony Shelton wrote, during my visits to Bangladesh and the Philippines, I heard similar stories and found them documented in the literature. In Bangladesh, farmers usually sprayed their crops barefooted, and as a result of widespread exposure, they reported experiencing multiple health effects, including headaches, eye and skin irritation, vomiting, and dizziness. In the Philippines, exposure of young children was a particular concern. They're often employed in the vegetable production as young as 6 to 9 years old. After the use of pesticides, children reported health symptoms, including headaches, skin irritation, and abdominal pain. Of course, bioengineered crops are controversial and require safety laws and regulations different in each country. Neither India nor the Philippines were willing to allow the development of Bt eggplant in their countries, but Bangladesh, which had no prior experience with biotech crops, permitted the testing of Bt eggplant. After 7 consecutive seasons under confined and open field conditions, and with high-level support within the Bangladeshi government, approval was granted in 2013. Although there was some pushback from anti-biotech organizations, the rate of adoption by Bangladeshi farmers was remarkably high. By 2021, more than 65,000 farms grew Bt eggplant with a 20% higher yield. And as the Bangladeshi Minister of Agriculture, Madhya Chowdhury, who had visited Cornell in 2011, noted, "My job as Minister of Agriculture is to feed 160 million people and protect the environment. And if Bt brinjal will help us achieve this, then we will move forward with it." In 2022, the Philippines finally granted final approval for cultivation of Bt eggplant for food, feed, and processing. And now Corey will comment on his favorite vignettes.
Thank you. So I want to start by just expressing what an honor it has been to work with these 3 Cornell legends on this project. The 3 of them have been such important parts of Cornell history in different ways, and so it was a real privilege to get to collaborate with the 3 of them as part of the editorial team. I also appreciate their patience with our generational differences. As the only member of the editorial team who isn't retired yet, I was not always able to be as responsive, especially when grading 400 student projects at the end of the semester. And so I appreciate their patience and putting up with my busy schedule as we work together over the last few years. I was asked to speak a little bit about our editing process as we tackled this project. And one of the biggest challenges of having 54 different authors is that we had 54 different writing styles and formats as we collected these vignettes. And so many of the chapters went through several rounds of editing with the authors as they were being submitted. For example, some chapters arrived and they were 40-page theses and needed to be whittled down to something a little bit more bite-sized for our purposes. But we wanted to preserve the individual author voices as we did this for each chapter. So the real challenge was the formatting for consistency and style across them. Cornell University Press uses the Chicago Manual of Style. So we all became very familiar with the Chicago Manual over the last couple of years. And this included things like deciding when numbers are spelled out versus when they are written as numerals. And we had much debate about the right ways to do that. Capitalization rules for regions and for titles, abbreviations, hyphenation. We had to go through all of these chapters and make sure we were being consistent. And with 4 different editors, you can imagine sometimes we had 4 different opinions on how some of these things should be done, how things should be formatted. And so you never realize how vague the rules are for comma usage until you try to make it consistent across 54 chapters, or 58 chapters, 54 authors, over 400 pages. But we had to tackle that problem of making sure comma usage was consistent. The other big challenge was managing the editing process so all 4 of us could have input on each chapter. So we had to develop a workflow that made sense where we weren't duplicating work and we were getting the chapters to each one of us. So we would do an initial edit for consistency, do some fact checking. It would go out for the other co-editors to take a look at, make their edits and suggestions, and then we would collect all those again and edit that chapter one final time, merge those edits together. And then we had to go back to the author and let them know what we had done to their chapter and make sure they were okay with those edits. And so, part of that involved talking through disagreements or questions that still remained as we had different edits throughout the process. And so you can imagine this took a lot of work with 54 authors that we were working with. A lot of back and forth, a lot of tracking different versions, and occasionally realizing that we were using an old version after something had been edited. And so it was a complicated process. And perhaps the most time-consuming part was not something I expected, and that was formatting citations. Citations was a real challenge. Some vignettes came in with no citations, some came in with incomplete citations, and so the editorial team had to go through each vignette, make sure things were thoroughly cited, make sure citations were in the right format, using Chicago style, and so this was a long process as well. With 4 editors, we're perhaps dangerously close to a too many cooks situation, but I think the final result really was higher quality thanks to each editor's input and perspective that they brought to the project. So some of my favorite parts of the book are those that focused on student life. I work with a lot of student organizations and a lot of alumni, and so the student elements really resonated with me. I think we take for granted today how international Cornell's student body is. But it was much more unusual in the 19th century, the fact that Cornell had such a cosmopolitan student body, as it was called back then. And if you think it's difficult to get to Ithaca today in 2024, imagine arriving in Ithaca in 1870 from Japan, when the first student from Japan enrolled at Cornell. That was a long trip, and you didn't go home for spring break. The first Japanese student arrives in that year, and that individual goes on to become one of the first permanent residents of the United States from Japan, which gives you an idea of how unusual it was to be traveling around the world at that point. Some of you might recognize this building, which is on Bryant Avenue in Collegetown, and this was built in 1911 for the Cornell Cosmopolitan Club. That was a student organization founded in 1904 by a student from Argentina, and this became Cornell's International Student Organization. It was one of the first of its kind in the United States, and it really served as a fraternity of sorts for international students coming from around the world. You can see the range of national flags hanging in front of the building, plus the American flags on top of it. The Cosmopolitan Club closed in 1954, although the building still exists as a private apartment building. But the club really played an important role paving the way for future international student organizations on campus. It provided a really important community for international students, as well as an opportunity to highlight different cultures, often through national nights that they would host, which would feature the cuisine and entertainment, dance, music from different countries around the world. It was a predecessor for today's Holland International Living Center, which opened in 1970 as a residence hall on North Campus at Cornell, which is still going strong. And we have a chapter about that as well. There's a chapter about the Cosmopolitan Club and a chapter about the Holland International Living Center. While I knew that Cornell's institutional support for international students extended far back in our history, one thing that I learned that I didn't know before was that Cornell was the first university to have a staff member dedicated to supporting international students, the first in the United States to do that, all the way back in 1933. And the other thing I learned was that the first person to hold that role, that first staff member, was John L. Mott. And I didn't know who John L. Mott was, but his father, John R. Mott, is one of Cornell's most famous alumni. He happens to be the only Cornellian to win a Nobel Peace Prize. And both John R. Mott and his son, John L. Mott, were involved with several global movements and organizations to promote brotherhood across national boundaries. And so it was neat to see the impact of the son of Cornell's Nobel Peace Prize winner as being the first staff member dedicated to international student support. Now, as an alumnus of the Cornell Glee Club, I wanted to make sure that their role as international ambassadors was included in the book. Cornell's student musicians have been traveling around the world since 1895, and that was the year when the musical clubs followed the Cornell crew to England for the Henley Regatta. The crew had been invited to compete at Henley. It was a big deal, and the musicians went along to offer a tour of concerts while in England. Unfortunately, the crew was accused of bad sportsmanship during this regatta, and the Glee Club's tour was pretty poorly planned and ended up having many of the concerts canceled. And so the result was a bunch of students stuck in London for the summer without enough money to travel home. And the trip actually ended up having a lasting legacy in Ithaca that some of you might be familiar with. The Savage Club of Ithaca was founded as a result of this trip. Some of you I see nodding your heads. It was a gentleman's club of artists and musicians and writers and entertainers in London. They adopted the wayward Cornellians who were stuck in London. They helped them find their way home, supported them, helped host them while they were figuring out their transportation home. And then those Cornellians, including folks like members of the Treeman family, Louis Agassiz Fuertes, the famous ornithology artist, they made their way back to Ithaca and founded an Ithaca chapter of the Savage Club of London. And so that's where that organization comes from. Of course, the Glee Club's most famous tour is the one pictured here, and that was their 1966 tour of East Asia. Students took the entire semester off from classes to spend 86 days traveling. They went to 10 countries funded by the US State Department as goodwill ambassadors that year. And it was estimated that more than 100 million people heard the Glee Club on that tour. They gave 49 formal concerts, 18 radio and television appearances, over 50 informal performances, impromptu performances during that trip. An enormous impact on the students having this experience too. Many of them had never traveled abroad before. This photo is taken on their visit to Okinawa. You can see them performing at the August Moon, the tea house of the August Moon on that trip. And you might recognize that's Tom Sokol, Professor Tom Sokol, the director of the Glee Club, leading the group of students in the dance there. Many of these students would go on to work or live in Asia thanks to the experiences they had on this trip. And one of them met his future wife on the trip and would go on to marry someone he met while traveling. Over the last few decades, members of the Glee Club, the Chorus, the Wind Ensemble, the Cornell Orchestra, all of these organizations have started semi-regular tours overseas and continued this tradition of musical ambassadors. And these trips really do give students unforgettable opportunities and experiences for cultural exchange. And our last chapter of the book is about another form of student exchange, and that's the Transatlantic Track and Field series that began back in 1921 with Cornell and Princeton competing against the track and field teams of Oxford and Cambridge. The British teams came to the United States in 1921. The cross-country team had actually gone overseas the year before and started the beginning of this exchange. The American teams would travel later on and go to England, and it begins this series that continues to this day, although Princeton got replaced by the University of Pennsylvania as Cornell's travel partner in the 1950s. It's likely one of the longest running recurring international exchanges in college athletics, going on for over a century now. And it's another great example of the impact that these trips can have on students who often didn't have other opportunities to travel. By the way, that's Charles Treeman in the front row of this photo of the track team from 1930, the second from the left in the front row. And another person, a name you might be familiar with, Carl Meinig, the father of Pete Meinig, the late chairman of the Cornell Board of Trustees, is the fourth from the left in the second row, both members of the Cornell track team as undergraduates. So to wrap things up, I will turn it back over to Elaine, who will give some closing remarks.
Actually, I will invite the panelists to come and speak, and we will take questions from the audience.
Not a question, but a comment. I probably have the longest personal experience with one of these projects. In 1956, 1957, I was in the Philippines at the Cornell Los Baños project with the University of the Philippines College of Agriculture. No, I wasn't a professor. I was a high school student. My father was the ag economist who was there at the time. And in fact, my father had involvement with one of these projects 20 years earlier when he spent a postdoc year at the University of Nanking in 1936, 1937, just after the Cornell Nanking project. So if you're interested in the Los Baños project, the University of the Philippines, talk to me afterwards.
And there is, of course, a chapter on the University of the Philippines project. And the author is here.
Any other questions?
Questions? Yeah.
Let's see.
No? Any
We do
Zoom
have
questions?
one in the chat,
One
I
in the
believe.
chat, okay.
It says, although the number of vignettes are numerous, did you have to eliminate many for various reasons?
I think we only eliminated one because it really wasn't very specific about the international component. No, actually, I think that really they were all pretty much on target, and we were really very, very pleased with the response we got when we sent out the message on the CAPE list.
Yeah.
Question in the, yeah.
I wondered if you have some commentary about what you personally feel, I don't know, you haven't done the research essentially, on comparing with other major universities in America, what the outreach has been from Cornell. I know, coming from Australia, that it's well known around the Southeast Asian region for all the work it's done. Many other higher learning institutions in America that have done the same thing, but how do you think Cornell's standing on a, let's have a grading here.
Well, I can't get the question.
The question was, how do we think Cornell compares to other American universities in its international efforts? Is that?
Well, I haven't looked at all the other universities in the country or in the world, but from what experience I have, I think that Cornell is clearly way ahead in having international experiences, not only for the students, but also for the faculty. I think the faculty have taught about overseas activities, but also have learned very much. I think, for example, of the vast experience we've had in the Philippines with IRRI and other activities in the Philippines. So I think we have done a great job at Cornell in bringing the border there for all of us to work on.
And I think it was sort of baked into Cornell from the beginning, that Frank Rhodes used to talk about the land grant to the world, but I think that there was some truth to that from the very beginning, Cornell recruited international professors. Cornell saw itself as having a role. And there was the joke that I think Francis Perkins was supposed to have said that Ithaca was the most isolated place on the Eastern Seaboard. And so partially, I think to combat some of the isolation here, we really did make specific efforts to go out into the world and to bring the world here.
I think the point about it going back to the beginning is an important one. Cornell's first and third president were both U.S. ambassadors, and so brought a global mindset early on in the university's history. And I think particularly when you look in the 19th century, the number of firsts that Cornell had related to international programs, international students. The first Brazilian students to get degrees in the United States arrive at Cornell just a few years after we opened. And even if you look at Ezra Cornell, he carried a little pocket diary where he listed every country that a student was from when they enrolled at Cornell. He was really proud of the fact that Cornell was a global institution in its first few years. International students when we opened, international faculty when we opened. So I think that early history plays a role in shaping the rest.
I'm curious about the budgetary issues in publishing a book like this.
Okay, well, let's see. Why don't you, Roy can tell you a little bit about, CAPE actually had a budget for this project. It was not substantial, but it was real. And so when we actually went to the Cornell Press, we actually had I guess what they call a subvention of about $12,000 to actually publish the book, a little bit more than that. We actually did solicit a gift from an alumnus. Jeff McCorkle was very generous and provided a little bit of extra funding, which allowed us to do the index and allowed a little bit of extra funding as well for the book. But really, the book was done at budget. none of us got paid. And any royalties that the book makes, we don't expect it to be a major motion picture, will actually go back to CAPE. So it was a CAPE project. And I think that the way we could do it was a lot of volunteer labor. The only thing we actually really paid for, other than the press, was the index. And we did have to hire a professional indexer.
Yep.
Oh,
I would just add one quick thing to that, and that is to mention that all of those 56, well, how many authors do we have? 54. 54 volunteered. They all volunteered. They didn't get 10 cents for their work. And so we are deeply indebted to them for what has come out of this.
As an author of one of the vignettes, I'd actually like to thank you guys for the splendid book and working with you. I enjoyed every minute of it. But I would like to ask a question, because I think the breadth of the book is what was much more than I expected when I agreed to write it. And then when I looked at it, I said, wow, there's so much here that I didn't know about Cornell, even though I knew about our global presence. And then earlier you mentioned that there were vignettes that you would have liked to have seen in the book that aren't there, and I was wondering what some of those might be.
Okay. The first one, I guess I would mention is we'd hoped to have something from the Laboratory of Ornithology, but they weren't able to contribute. We actually approached them, but they weren't able to contribute at that point.
There were a lot of organizations that we considered highlighting. Some are just mentioned in other vignettes. We talked about the Gamelan Ensemble, for instance, as another musical organization with international connections that isn't highlighted but has an interesting story behind it.
Yeah, and there were definitely some of the international programs that are coming out of different colleges that we could not cover, or we also approached some departments, but we also didn't want to, make it a department vignette stories. We wanted to be very careful that it's also not just a book about different alumni. I mean, we could have just featured 100 alumni and their international experiences and all the wonderful things. So we tried there also to be selected, but it's a very good question.
I observed after the book was out that we were going to get criticism for the book because we left out something. And my answer to that has been Volume 2. Go to it.
One perspective on the growth and importance of Cornell in the world could be derived from thinking the year I graduated from Cornell was 1950. If you went to the Cornell Library catalog and asked what you could read about Southeast Asia, almost nothing. 2 years later, I was in Washington beginning to write morning briefings on Southeast Asian politics. At that time, the knowledge base on Southeast Asia in Washington was minimal, and that's an exaggeration. Today, the library at Cornell on Southeast Asia is one of the greatest in the world. It's always been one of the leading, I think maybe the biggest collection in America outside of the Library of Congress.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And there is a section on the library collection that includes the Southeast Asia collection.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading this. Cornell is, I try to explain to people that we're Ivy League, that we're land grant, but I love the land grant to the world. And this gives a dimension, it sounds like a very readable dimension, because everyone loves to read stories, it gives publicity, opening to people understanding this incredible global dimension of Cornell. And as a former student, a former postdoc, and an emerita professor, and a mother of kids who went here, and Glee Club and Chorus, and Corey knows my kids. Yeah, I've really just gone whole hog. But this is wonderful, because it highlights how unusual this funny little place in the middle of upstate New York is. And I'm, as I say, I'm looking forward to reading it, and I really enjoyed the presentation and the various vignettes that you gave us today.
Thank you.
I just want to direct this briefly, mostly to the Kendall residents here, and mention Cornell's program in Qatar, which is directed at pre-med education. It's maybe 10, 15 years old, or I'm not sure. There is a section in the book about it, which is very interesting. And what some of you may or may not know is that one of our prominent residents, who I had hoped would be here, but I don't see him right now, Tom Rischel, spent, are you? I can't see him, but pardon? He just left. Well, he taught there for a couple of years and knows a lot about it. If any of you are interested, you should talk to him. And he was one of several people from Cornell's math department that helped with that, the education piece of that program. I wanted to mention that.